Hi class, welcome to the lecture video for chapter 39. We're again looking at 15th century Renaissance in Italy. Just like we were last week when we finished up looking at Florence, today we're going to be moving outward because as we move into the 15th century, Florence is no longer the only Italian city to really embrace the Renaissance and this kind of new style of art. It spreads north at this point to cities such as Urbino, Rome, and Venice. Everything in this chapter, just like chapter 38, would be the period style will be early Renaissance Italy. Really, the only difference we're looking at is the location, because it sort of starts all of it in Florence that we looked at in 38, and now as it's developed, it's moving around Italy, and we're starting to see it in these different cities. So today we're actually going to start with Urbino, and particularly we're going to look at the Ducal Palace. We'll see, and we're going to stick with the Ducal Palace for a little while. So let's talk about it just a little bit. So Duke Federico de Montefeltro, who was the Duke of Urbino, he oversaw extensive renovations on the Ducal Palace in Urbino that started out as a medieval structure, and he came in and added several enclosed courtyards, and he extended the living spaces within the walled palace. To help transition to fit this new Renaissance humanist idea, particularly those of the Renaissance architect, Leon Battista Alberti, who basically would said that enlightened rulers govern from gracious palaces accessible to citizens, not fortified castles. So medieval castles would have been these very heavy fortified structures, and he goes in and tries to lighten things up and make it much more align the Renaissance styles and this humanist idea. So in order to achieve this, he actually brought in many of the best artists of the day from all over Italy to work on it. And if we move in, we see one of the added courtyards, these beautiful tall Corinthian columns that are holding up arches all around the square shape of the space. These are very much done in this classic Renaissance style. All of this is connecting back to classical Greek and Roman architecture. Besides this courtyard, the Duke also added several wings of rooms, more courtyards, towers, and also the largest library in Italy at the time. And previously, I mentioned that he brought in a number of artists to work in the palace. One of these was an artist you've likely heard of, who is Piero della Francesca. And Francesca, or Piero, had previously worked in Florence in the 1430s, and so he had been around a lot of this Italian style, but eventually he had settled into his home region of San Sepolcro in Tuscany before he eventually goes to work for the Duke in Urbino. Much of Piero's work is based on the landscape of his hometown and the areas around it, and also he really explores the individuality of figures that he's observed in real life. So the other thing with his is he was a trained mathematician, which can really be seen in a lot of the ways that he approaches perspective in his paintings, because we started talking about this idea of perspective when we started talking about the Italian Renaissance, and this idea of linear perspective, kind of mathematical. It's very much going to be involved in a lot of the art that we see in this chapter as well. So a large majority of Piero della Francesca's paintings had biblical themes, such as the one we see here, which is the baptism of Christ. This was actually created at the center of a polyptych and originally painted for the chapel of St. John the Baptist in San Sepolcro, which again is Piero's hometown. And so the background and landscape that you see around here is all based on San Sepolcro. So you'll notice things that kind of stay very consistent with his style. He has kind of this cool color palette, lots of geometrical compositions. You'll notice this is tempera on wood panel. We're starting to see some oil at this point, but it's just beginning to be a medium. So we'll look at oil heavily actually in the next chapter. And then this idea of these bright colors. So everything we see with tempera tends to be a little bit more muted. And also the idea of foreshortening has been well developed by this time, and it can be seen here if you look at the picture on the right, the dove and the bowl. Both of those are this idea of foreshortening. So if you're unfamiliar with this idea, foreshortening is basically making a two-dimensional object appear as if it's receding back into space, and then the adjustments to the actual shape of it to help give this illusion of depth. So it looks as if the bird is actually flying at us, not showing us the profile of a bird. One of the ways I always think about how to think of foreshortening in something is a technique that really shows the artist's expertise, because you're having to take a very familiar object and paint it in a different way. One of the ways I always say to practice this is if you'll take your finger and hold it straight up in the air, like if you're pointing up, and look at your finger, look at the shape of your finger. It looks like a finger. You have, all the knuckles, you have all of those things. Now take your finger and point it directly at you. It completely changes shape, and it does not look like a finger if you look at it, but you understand that it's a finger. So it has to be drawn in a different way. And that's basically what the foreshortening does, is it allows the object that you're looking at to appear to go backward in space and adjust the shape of that form and able to make it look correct as it goes back that way. It was a technique that was used to add to paintings, but it was to really add this idea of depth, but it really was also a demonstration of the artist's expertise. It's often used in Renaissance art to add an extra element of naturalism to the work as well. So when we look at the painting itself, we see this very solid composition. We're starting to see the triangular shape here. There's emphasis on upright forms. If you look at like the white body of Jesus, the tree to his left, and even the legs of the figure in the background to his right, all sort of have these very vertical forms. The overall format of this is vertical, so lots of tall, upright things. To the left, we see three angels that are in traditional robes, and different than what we normally see, they have crowns of flora. This definitely shows this evolution of Renaissance art, because gone here are the gold disc-like halos that we would have seen in medieval and Gothic art. We'll still see some halos in Renaissance art, but they tend to be very thin gold rings, often very visible, or very much like we have here are these figures that actually have sort of flora on them to suggest their holiness. Also, if we look at our figures, they're very human looking. As I mentioned, Piero observed those around him and utilized their features in his work. He wasn't trying to create these sort of perfect forms and idealized figures that we really think about when we think about like Greek art in particular. But he's trying to make them feel very human, very personal. And so this can definitely be seen here in this, one of the few paintings that are not Christian. These are two of the portraits. These are two portraits that he painted. They are of Duke Federico and then his wife, Battista Sforza, who actually was recently deceased when this was painted. So Federico is highly naturalized. If we look at him, he's got a very distinctive facial shape and facial features. It's also believed that they were painted like this to allow naturalism, but not show some of the disfiguration that's on the other side of the face of the Duke. When he was younger, he had lost his right eye in battle, and then his nose, if you'll notice, is sort of this oddly shaped nose. It had been broken earlier in life as well. So, but these were very distinctive features of the Duke, so they do have to in some way be incorporated. Now, if we look at his wife, she's a little more idealized, a little more ethereal looking. There's no wrinkles hardly. There's just very smooth skin, but she's also very pale. And it's almost as if her head is kind of outlined, which really helps to flatten it a little bit. Your textbook actually suggests that this is a memorial because of the memorial painting to her, and this idealism could suggest a celebration of her after her death, or even maybe the idea of a death mask. But this full slide profile was a very traditional Italian portrait style, and this goes all the way back to ancient Rome. If you remember looking at Rome, we looked at things like coins with lots of figures in profile, those kind of things. So this was very much a traditional technique, again, sort of connecting to this classical ideas. Now, if we move beyond the couple themselves and look at the landscape, so this highly, highly detailed landscape is very personal to the couple. It's representative of their lands and also their wealth. But here, Piero's done something a little differently. We've talked about linear perspective. Here, he's actually used what's called atmospheric perspective. And atmospheric perspective is this way of representing distance based on detail. As the space moves backwards, the details begin to be lost. Outlining becomes kind of blurred. Colors become more pale, gray, sometimes even kind of a blue color, and showing less contrast. And then the object's closer to the viewer. So as it goes off into the distance, think about if you're standing on a hillside, things get kind of gray as they go further out. That's what this technique sort of embraces, is this idea of losing minute details as you get further and further away. So definitely a suggestion of depth here as well. Less mathematical, more intuitive, and this idea of atmospheric perspective. So we're going to look at one more work of his before we move on, and that is his resurrection. And this is the resurrection of Jesus, or the resurrection of Christ. This is not in your textbook, but this is one of those paintings that I feel like always should be looked at because it is a wonderful example of his work and very representative of early Renaissance art in Italy in general. Here we are back to a Christian theme. This time, this is the resurrection of Jesus after he's been crucified on the cross, died, and then 3 days later he comes back to life. This is a painting that was created for the meeting hall of the Palazzo dei Conservatori in San Sepolcro. Today it's actually now the Civic Museum, but it's this idea of Christ as victor. This was a very popular theme. We're going to see it in a number of different artists as we go through the next few hundred years. But this one is very much personal to San Sepolcro because while it's about the resurrection of Jesus, this is also a time when the people of San Sepolcro had just regained freedom from the Pope and Church. So this idea of Christ as victor definitely made a connection with them. And this painting is really more about about composition than adhering to reality. Here we have Jesus holding this victory flag. He looks very like I just overcame everything, leg propped up, looking very, very victorious. This is very different than a lot of the resurrection paintings of Jesus for a number of reasons. One, he is actually coming out of a coffin or sarcophagus, but according to biblical story, his tomb was not a sarcophagus. He actually was buried in a cave where the stone was rolled away to show that his body was gone. And this is a time in the story that's before he's been discovered by the various women that find him when women find his tomb is open and gone. Most often we'll see him appearing to Mary or disciples or someone after he has risen. Here, we're not to that point yet. He's actually being surrounded by Roman guards watching over his tomb. And if we move in a little bit closer with the image on the right, you'll see the beginning of the letters SPQR. It actually stands for Senatus Populusque Romanus, which stands for the Senate and the Roman people. And this is a heavily used symbol of Rome at that time and even well in through today. So this is definitely Roman soldiers. All of our figures look a little interesting. We have a very stable composition. We have 3 or 4 different triangles, depending on how you want to look at it. Jesus sort of makes his own triangle at the very top. The overall composition with all of the figures here from the very top of the flag all the way down to the far sides of each of the soldiers, they have spread out. And this, again, they're stacked along the bottom to make this very stable composition. And then each set of soldiers, if you look at the 2 on the left, the one that almost appears dead, but he is supposed to be asleep, he and the figure to his left make a small triangle. And then the 2 figures on the right, the one leaning on the sword with the shield in his hand and the other one that's kind of leaning off to the side, those make a triangular composition as well. So lots of different forms, lots of stability, very, very Italian Renaissance. Interestingly, about this fresco, during World War II, the city of San Sepolcro was supposed to be bombed by the Allied forces, but the pilot that was flying the plane with the bombs on it was an art lover. and he had read about the Resurrection, which was supposed to be the greatest painting in the world. And so because of this, he just couldn't face bombing San Sepolcro, and so he called off the bombing and saved not only the painting, but the city itself as well. So this made even more legend, added some more legend to this painting too. So now we're going to move from north from Urbino to Mantua as we look at the work of Andre Mantegna. And so Mantegna worked as the court painter for Ludovico Gonzaga, who was the Marquis of Mantua. And Mantua is a city in between Venice and Milan in northern Italy. So like Duke Federico, he followed these humanist ideas. His court was a place for humanist art and for literature to flourish. Mantegna, I'm having problems saying his name today. Mantegna was trained in Padua, and he was a great admirer of the work of Donatello, who we looked at last week. What Mantegna actually becomes known for, though, is his impeccable trompe-l'oeil paintings. If you're not familiar with the term trompe-l'oeil means to fool the eye. These were works that were so perfectly rendered, they seemed to actually be three-dimensional objects or three-dimensional spaces. So effectively, they would take the ideas of perspective, of foreshortening, and then lots of other recently developed spatial techniques and combine them to basically make two-dimensional works of art appear to actually take up space. And we can definitely see that here with the Camera Picta or the Camera degli Sposi. This is considered one of the absolute greatest triumphs of trompe-l'oeil from this period, and well, pretty much any. This is in the Ducal Palace, not in Urbino, but in Mantua. And it is a fresco. And the name Camera Picta, which is what it's often called, means painted room. The name Camera degli Sposi means bridal chamber. So either one of those names would be just fine for this one. This was a fresco that took 9 years to complete. And it's believed to be the bridal chamber of Ludovico's son. The figures painted around the room are the Ludovico family, and this would have allowed them to serve as witnesses to the consummation of the marriage. So on the ceiling, if you see at the very top, moving toward the oculus, or this sort of oculus image, are figures from Greek mythology. There's Roman rulers on there as well. This definitely sort of helped establish the family's humanist connection to these very classical cultures. The room was later used for meetings in the palace as well. This was kind of the special room if it was an important meeting, if it was an important guest coming. They would have all met in this room in particular. If you'll notice, the room is painted as a pavilion that's completely open on the sides, and it's under this very ornate canopy. The room was actually reshaped. The walls were moved around to make it a perfect square. It is 26 feet and 6 inches square, again, adding to this illusion of this square outdoor pavilion. It's also one of the earliest versions that we'll see when we look at the oculus part of it that will become a popular Italian and Renaissance Baroque style, which is called di sotto in su, and basically it means as seen from below. So when we move in, we see the family. We see lots of figures here. This is what's known as the court scene, and Ludovico is surrounded by members of family. He's conversing with his secretary. He's on the far left there, kind of in this sort of pinkish form, having a conversation with his secretary. And there's some things that are in here. We see the family, but there's also many things to help suggest that he is a good person and a good ruler. His faithful dog is under his chair. There's that's very highly naturalistic rather than idealized, showing that he is truthful in his portrayal in art. So he is a truthful person in real life as well. You'll notice next, kind of in the middle of the door frame that you see on top there, you see there's a little person. A little person was very popular to have at court. They helped to show the status because they were wealthy enough to bring in this person just to just to hang out and entertain. And they were also seen very much as a novelty. So you'll often see them painted into works at this time of royalty or high political offices, because this was something that tended to be at court. So it's not a child; it actually is a little person. The one thing about this room is you'll see actual stone corbels that are framed by painted arches. And this is one of those rooms that it's very confusing to see what is real and what is painted. You actually have to look very closely in some cases because especially when we move into the oculus, everything that you see here is painted. It's as if figures were on top of the roof with this gate, with this sort of this fencing around it, looking down into the room. Again, this idea of trompe l'oeil, and we'll definitely see the use of it become much more prevalent as we get into the High Renaissance. And this idea of de sotto in su, which is, you know, looking up as if everyone's kind of, it takes into account exactly where you're looking from. So it would be painted as if someone was standing on the ground looking up in this. So you're actually looking as if you're looking through this hole in the ceiling or this oculus. But again, everything that you see here is painted. The moldings, all of this stuff that looks, you can see the different shading on it. You can see just touches of aging in various forms. All of this is paint. There is nothing that you're looking at right now that is not paint. So everything was done perfectly in this idea of trompe l'oeil. But we have lots of things going on to help suggest this idea of marriage and the wedding night. We have courtiers that are looking down into the room. Some of them have their servants with them. We have these little putti, or these little baby angels that are floating, that are kind of hanging on around the edges of the fence. We also have a peacock here. So a peacock likely would have been a bird that was kept at court. Again, these were very popular to have at court. But it also could be a suggestion of reference to Greek mythology. The Greek goddess Hera, who was the goddess of marriage, was one of her images, one of her iconography images was a peacock. So lots of things going on here. We have a little even element of kind of danger. If you look to the right side of this very precariously balanced flower pot that's kind of on just sort of this rod over there, almost as if someone accidentally touched it, it would fall in. And then the other thing to me that seems a little dangerous are these, you know, naked little angels that are hanging, these baby angels that are hanging there with nothing between you and them. So, but lots and lots of action going on. We have one that's even kind of holding on inside the fence here. So lots of activity, lots of movement, very much this idea of adding witnesses to this wedding night. So Mantegna really becomes, again, this idea of trompe l'oeil and recreating reality. He is a super proficient in foreshortening and all of the various techniques to make the space seem real in this two-dimensional painting. So another work of his, but very different, very characteristic of his work, is his Lamentation of Christ. Most often it's called the Dead Christ. We've seen this subject before. Last week we looked at Giotto in the Arena or Scrovegni Chapel. We saw the Lamentation there. This one's a little bit different. That was late Gothic, so we're definitely Renaissance here. There's some questions about its provenance because we don't know what happened to it for a few hundred years. The only thing that's known about it way far in history is it ended up in the inventory of Charles I of England in 1628 and then disappeared until the early 19th century where it resurfaced in Italy. But definitely this use of foreshortening and all of these things that Mantegna is very well known for. Actually over foreshortening in this case, because if you start looking at our figures, some things look a little odd. And if you look at his legs in particular, they seem very short. Well, Mantegna he was doing this painting as if he was standing at the feet of Jesus whenever they brought him down from the cross, laid him out after his death. If he actually would have painted this naturalistically with everything foreshortened, the legs would have been a large majority of the painting, and that's not that's not what the important part of this is. So here he shortens the legs quite a bit So you can see the deathly, the eyes closed and the face of Christ showing he's dead. You see the nail holes from being crucified in his hands and his feet. The mourners are also kind of gathering on and very much emotional. And this was supposed to be a heavy emotional impact, as if you were standing there observing this and actually seeing all of this happen in person. So very, very highly emotional. And it's actually been suggested by a number of scholars that this was not something he painted for a patron, but rather for a private devotion for him particularly. This is a very intimate subject, and also the size is much, much smaller than what he tended to paint. It's actually only 27 by 32 inches, so a much smaller portion, a much smaller image for this. So again, this idea of kind of a personal devotion, something that he could stand in front of and feel as if he was being involved in the lamentation. And again, this sort of emotion over anatomical correctness, which tends to be very common in early Renaissance. Okay, now let's move to Rome and look at several artists who were patronized by the church in particular. So we're going to start with the Sistine Chapel. And when we begin to talk about the Sistine Chapel, generally, everyone immediately goes to Michelangelo, right? The ceiling, it's been talked to death. But we're going to start a little earlier than that. So the Sistine Chapel was built to serve a very important purpose in the Catholic Church that is still used for today. It is where the cardinals gather to elect the new pope. Again, most often when we talk about painting in the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo comes to mind. His contributions are very important, but they come about 30 years after the part that we're going to look at in this chapter is finished. So we're going to talk about Pietro Vannucci, also called Perugino, and he was named after his hometown of Perugia in Umbria. He worked in both Florence and Rome, and Perugino was the teacher of Raphael, who we will look at in a few weeks. So one of his most well-known commissions was to paint murals on the walls of the Sistine Chapel, which had just recently been built. So Perugino, along with 4 other artists, including Botticelli, who we looked at last week, they were hired by Pope Sixtus IV to paint images from the life of Jesus on the wall, running down each side of the chapel. One side was the life of Jesus, the other side was the life of Moses. And it's believed that Perugino was actually the head of the overall project, and we do know that he contributed the largest number of paintings this time to the chapel. The one we're going to look at in this class is this one here. You can just see a little bit of it off to the side. It's circled in red, and so when we move a little closer to it, it is called Christ Giving the Keys to St. Peter, or Delivering the Keys to St. Peter. So Perugino drew influence for his architecture in this painting from some very well-known architecture of modern and historic times. We have a prolific use of linear perspective here. Absolutely, I think it's pretty easy to see. But when we talk about some of the architecture and some of his influences, when we look at the dead center, there's a church in the middle, and it's at the center horizon of the painting. His influence was from Florence Cathedral, which we looked at last week. Also, he was influenced by the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem and the Temple of Solomon. All of these were basically religious structures that had 8 sides. So he sort of drew all of that and combined it together. But this does look very similar to the Dome of Florence Cathedral that we looked at with Brunelleschi. Now, on the 2 sides, we see these triumphal arches, and definitely this connection to the Arch of Constantine, which, if you were in Survey 1, you looked at it, the Arch of Constantine with those 4 roundels, and really help identify the arch. This classical Roman construction would also be understood by modern audiences because Constantine was very important to the church. He was the first emperor to legalize the Christian faith, so they would easily be able to see these, recognize it, and make that connection. But the subject here is Christ delivering the keys to St. Peter, and so we see St. Peter actually receiving the keys to the church. This identifying factor we'll see in work from now on, pretty much with Peter and even some before this, you'll see him holding the keys, because basically Jesus gave him the keys to his church on earth, which would definitely make a connection with the Catholic Church. The Pope is supposed to be representative of St. Peter, hence in St. Peter's Basilica. We see a very common theme. We talked about this last week a little bit, this idea of Jesus and the apostles all are dressed in classical dress. You can see very easily which one of these are biblical figures and which one of them are modern figures, because we have all of our biblical figures in togas and Greek and Roman looking dress, and then on the right you'll notice a lot more of them that are in modern dress for this time. So those would have been current figures within the church. Again, very clear linear perspective. The tiles make the grid. The vanishing point is very easy to follow through. If you look right here, it all pops up. We see Jesus and Peter within the same line. Jesus is handing the key of the church. There's a straight line to the church. So all of this kind of coming together to show us what's important. This is definitely early Renaissance, because all of our main figures and all of the weight of the painting is at the bottom front. So everybody's kind of lined up. When we get into high Renaissance, and really when we get into Baroque, we'll definitely see all of our figures be, we'll say, a little more dispersed throughout works. But when we're trying to identify it as like early Renaissance versus high Renaissance or late Renaissance, all of these figures, these main figures lined up at the bottom, it definitely screams that. You can almost draw lines between each of the groups as you go the way back. We have this idealized Italian landscape in the background, and all of this kind of connecting the Italian church that was just built, or the Sistine Chapel connecting to St. Peter's Basilica. All of this showing the importance of the church and St. Peter as the first pope. So let's move on. And the last artist we're going to look at in this period is Verrocchio. The reason that your book, I don't actually cover any of the images that are in your book, because I'm not loving which ones that they chose to represent him. But Verrocchio he was a sculptor and a painter. He actually originally trained as a goldsmith, so he's very big on details. He actually became a favorite sculptor of the Medici family after Donatello's death, and he was the teacher of Leonardo da Vinci. So here we see a subject that we looked at last week with David. Again, younger figure. This one is a little older looking than we saw with Donatello's version. Here we have him fully clothed, and he's a little different looking than Donatello's. Remember, Donatello's was sort of looking down, kind of closed in. The same time within the story, he's already killed Goliath. His head is at his feet. Here he has a sword in hand. He actually used to have there used to be a rock on this as well, because David actually killed him with a slingshot. So there was a rock that was originally on the head of Goliath, but at some point it got lost through history apparently. And then David has Goliath's sword in his hand as well. So we have a figure here that's a little more aware of the body. He's much more muscular than we saw with the David of Donatello. We do still have this idea of contrapposto. And if you look at the clothing, it's almost sheer. You can see all of the muscular behind it. You can count every single rib, and even where it lays like over the chest area, you're seeing things like the nipples and all of this. So it's got clothing, but it's suggestive of not having clothing. And if you kind of can't see in the images here as well, but if you look closely, and it appears to be Arabic inscriptions that are all around this trim. It's very highly detailed. It's just decorative, but it's also meant to suggest this biblical times and the Holy Land, and connecting back to the story of David. So this was actually commissioned to go in the courtyard of the Medici Palace, and Donatello's sculpture was currently there. And that gave a little bit of challenge to Verrocchio, following in someone he really appreciated, to create this sculpture that could match the older artist's skills. And because those two were in the same place, I always like to look at them side by side. And so when we see them side by side, we see Donatello is more closed pose. David's turned more inward, again, almost as if the viewer's kind of intruding on his thoughts, while Verrocchio's David's more open. He's aware of his surroundings. He's just sort of thinking about what he did, but he's watching around him as well, kind of inviting the viewer in. And this comparison I find is a great way to show this development from early Renaissance art in Italy from the very beginning to where we're starting to transition to the high Renaissance, which is what we're going to look at in a few weeks. So that is going to wrap us up for Italian Renaissance. The next chapter, we're going to be moving into Northern Europe, and there's some very distinctly different styles that are not we get into Northern Renaissance than what we've been looking at with Italian.